Okay, so we're going to get through some terminology. We won't take too much time on this. I know terminology is not that much fun, but it's going to be a little bit helpful as we work through the zaps and applets. So let's look at something that I think is really important to get right at the very beginning, and it's the difference between an integration and an automation. So an integration is simply two apps being able to talk to one another. They're connected in some way. They can integrate together. An automation really refers to a workflow or a process that you are trying to automate. So to show the difference here, MailChimp has an integrations piece. So we'll jump over there and you can see they even call it integrations. When we go down, the greatest example here is Google Analytics. You're able to integrate with Google Analytics so that MailChimp and Google Analytics can talk to each other. There's a beautiful integration. Doesn't look like there's much of a workflow happening. It's just two things talking to one another. Automation, on the other hand, can look very complex and have a lot of steps, a lot going on. And to demonstrate that, we're going to look at a Zap that we're going to touch on later on. And you can see here that there is a lot happening with lots of different apps. We have Slack, we have Gmail, Google Drive, HubSpot, Wufoo. So this is what an automation might look like. Two very different things. Automations use the integrations, the ability for apps to talk to each other, but they're very different. So now that we got that situated, the next piece here is a little bit more about Zapier and IFT and their terminology. Zapier, those workflows, those automations that I just showed you, they call them zaps, whereas IFT calls them applets. Pretty straightforward. Zapier calls all the partners and all those apps that were listed out as apps, as you would expect, and then IFT calls them services for some reason. Either way, they are basically the same thing. Zapier calls the pieces of their automations triggers and actions. The trigger starts the workflow, and actions are what actually happens for the workflow. And IFT, they don't really have a specific terminology. I think that's because their applets are much simpler. They have an if this, which is essentially the trigger, and then they call it actions after the fact, just like Zapier. Zapier also has something called tasks. These are more or less just actions, but they are how they have their pricing model set up is how many tasks you use. So one trigger triggers a workflow, and then let's say it sends an email, that's considered a task. In IFT, they just have activity, nothing that's like tasks. I think it's because they don't really have a pricing model that matches what Zapier does. So that's it. Just simple terminology. We'll bring these terms up again, so wanted to make sure that you got them straight. We're going to jump in and get set up. We're going to sign up for Zapier, create your first Zap, and then get into a lot of the examples. So we'll see you in the next lecture.